Imagine waking up in a quiet medieval village, surrounded not by barbed wire or border patrols, but by vast open fields, winding paths, and the distant silhouette of a forested ridge. You lace up your boots and start walking. Hours go by. You pass through small hamlets, hear unfamiliar dialects, smell foreign spices in local markets, and yet no one stops you. No guard checks your ID. No wall looms in your path. At some point, without knowing it, you've left one lord's territory and entered another's. You've crossed a border, but there was no sign to mark it. In today's world, we associate borders with passport stamps, military outposts, surveillance drones, and towering steel fences that stretch across deserts and seas. We treat them as immovable, sacred lines that separate us from them. A line that defines your nation, your identity, your legal rights. But it wasn't always like this. In fact, for most of human history, borders weren't even lines. So how did ancient and medieval societies define and defend their lands? Were their boundaries fixed and guarded like ours today, or were they more like zones of influence, blurred and negotiated, sometimes shifting with the seasons or the will of a powerful warlord? What if I told you that for centuries, entire kingdoms shared frontiers without fences, and the concept of border security, as we know it, simply didn't exist? Welcome to a time when borders were not walls, but relationships, when control meant loyalty, not GPS coordinates, and power flowed not from checkpoints, but from trust, fear, oaths, and reputation. In this video, we're going to unravel the myth of the border as a timeless truth. We'll travel across forgotten marches, into buffer zones and tribal lands, to reveal a world where the edges of power were as fluid and alive as the people who walked them. Ready to step across the invisible line? Borders are a familiar concept today. They define nations, govern laws, and separate peoples. But this wasn't always the case. In the ancient and medieval worlds, borders were often less about lines and more about zones, gradual transitions between areas of influence, culture, and language. Instead of fixed GPS coordinates, borders were negotiated through power, language, faith, and diplomacy. Some were fortified, others were barely acknowledged. Some were places of violence, others were crossroads of exchange and transformation. This video will take you through the rich and complex history of borders before the modern era. We'll examine Roman frontiers, medieval marches, tribal buffer zones, and the ever-shifting dynamics between empires and kingdoms. We'll discover how these ancient boundaries helped shape the world we live in today. The Romans had a concept of borders known as the limes. But this wasn't a sharp line across a map. Rather, it was a frontier zone, often fortified, but always transitional. One of the most famous examples is Hadrian's Wall, built around 122 AD in northern Britain. It stretched about 117 kilometers across the island and was designed to mark the northern limit of Roman control. Yet, Hadrian's Wall was not merely a wall. It was a controlled gate. Soldiers were stationed at mile castles, trade continued through official crossings, and Roman culture blended with local customs. The wall was not the end of the world, it was a filter, not a brick wall. Limes Arabicus. In the deserts of what is now Jordan and Syria, the Limes Arabicus was a Roman defensive network extending across over 1,500 kilometers. It was composed of forts, roads, and watchtowers. But like other Roman borders, it was permeable. Bedouin tribes traded across it, and some were even integrated into the Roman military system. The Romans didn't seek to isolate themselves from the world beyond the frontier. Rather, they managed the edge, extending their influence while recognizing the autonomy and power of those beyond. Modern borders are rigid and legalistic. With the rise of the nation-state in the 17th to 19th centuries, borders became precise, demarcated by treaties, maps, and international recognition. They are now tied to concepts of citizenship, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Today, crossing a border can mean entering a different legal system, language zone, and political identity. It may involve visa processes, background checks, and customs declarations. National governments build walls, patrol coastlines, and monitor airspace. But before modern bureaucracy and cartography, borders served different purposes. Understanding their ancient counterparts helps us challenge the assumption that boundaries are fixed, impermeable, or even necessary in the form we know them. The Anglo-Scottish border. In medieval Europe, borders were often vague and contested. The Anglo-Scottish border is a prime example. Though the Treaty of York in 1237 defined much of it, the area remained fluid. Clans such as the Armstrongs, Douglases, and Grahams held sway over regions between the kingdoms, sometimes resisting both crowns. The debatable lands, a stretch of land between the Esk and Sark rivers, were essentially lawless. Both England and Scotland claimed them, but neither effectively controlled them. Instead, local families ruled through violence, loyalty, and negotiation. This was not a border of lines and fences. It was a living frontier, one that pulsed with power struggles, alliances, and cultural fusion. The Marches of Europe. In other parts of Europe, marches functioned as borderlands. These were buffer zones administered by powerful lords known as margraves. The Holy Roman Empire, for example, established marches in eastern Germany, Hungary, and Austria. These territories were tasked with defending against external threats, Slavs, Magyars, or Islamic armies. Yet, marches were also places of settlement and expansion. German-speaking settlers moved eastward, creating cultural blend zones. These frontiers often gave rise to new polities, languages, and identities. A march was not a wall. It was a gray area, militarized, but also fertile for innovation and hybridity. The nature of ancient and medieval borders had profound implications for the development of civilizations. In places where borders were zones of interaction, trade routes flourished. Silk, spices, knowledge, and art crossed these frontiers, enriching both sides. In contrast, fortified or militarized borders often became sites of long-term hostility. The lines drawn in Roman times, like the Rhine and Danube, continued to shape divisions in later centuries. The conflicts between England and Scotland, or between Christian and Muslim territories in Iberia, laid the groundwork for modern nationalisms. But even where borders created tension, they also produced unique cultures. The Andalusian frontier, for instance, was home to a fusion of Christian, Jewish, and Islamic thought. The Balkans, lying at the edge of empires, generated a rich mosaic of language and tradition. Borders may seem distant, but they affect our daily lives. Think of how passports, visas, and citizenship define your freedom to move. Consider the legacy of colonial borders drawn with little regard for the people living there. These lines continue to create conflict, from Africa to the Middle East to Eastern Europe. Ask yourself, where do you live? Was your region ever a frontier zone? Are there communities nearby that reflect the crossing of old boundaries, through architecture, cuisine, or language? Borders are not just physical. They are emotional, cultural, and historical. They shape how we see others and ourselves. Borders don't have to be barriers. They can be bridges. Cross-border trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, and international research collaborations show that cooperation across borders is possible, even beneficial. Some scholars suggest moving toward functional borders, which focus on zones of activity, economic, cultural, environmental, rather than strict territorial lines. The Schengen area in Europe is an example of how borders can be relaxed in favor of mutual trust and shared governance. Cities like Strasbourg, which once symbolized the divide between France and Germany, are now places of reconciliation. Borderlands need not be scars, they can be seams, stitching humanity together. Borders have always existed in some form, whether as rivers, mountains, stones laid in the dirt, or the invisible lines drawn in people's minds. But what they meant, and how they were used, has shifted dramatically through time. In the Roman world, borders, the limes, were not only military frontiers, but cultural filters, points where empires met the unknown. In the medieval world, marches and buffer zones weren't fixed lines, but fluid regions of negotiation and coexistence, where identities overlapped, alliances shifted, and control was rarely absolute. Even among tribal societies, where there were no maps or fortresses, the idea of territory was still real, anchored not by fences, but by relationships, rituals, and shared understandings. What this tells us is profound. Borders have never only been about exclusion. They have also been about connection, cooperation, and the balance of power. They were places of diplomacy, commerce, marriage, conflict, and sometimes peace. In the modern era, we've grown accustomed to borders as hard barriers, rigid, surveilled, and defended. But history reminds us that this is just one version of the story. The way we draw lines, physically and politically, has always been a choice, shaped by fear or by trust, by ambition or by understanding. Perhaps the most powerful lesson the past offers us is this. There are many ways to define a boundary, and even more ways to cross one. And sometimes, the most meaningful borders aren't those that separate us, but the ones that invite us to meet, to exchange, to learn, and to transform. To understand the past is to reimagine the future, a future where borders don't have to divide us, but can instead open up new possibilities for how we share space, power, and identity on this planet we all call home. The next time you look at a map, ask yourself, is that line a wall? Or a conversation? If this journey through ancient and medieval borders sparked your curiosity, or even changed the way you think about the lines that shape our world, don't let the story stop here. Give this video a like to help more people uncover these hidden chapters of our shared past. Subscribe to the channel for more thoughtful explorations into history, geography, identity, and power. And most importantly, join the conversation in the comments. What's the most fascinating historical border you've ever come across? Do you live near a border that once had a different meaning, or that still carries echoes of the past? Have you ever crossed a boundary, not just geographically, but culturally or emotionally, that shifted how you see yourself or the world? Your story matters. Borders are more than maps and markers, they're human experiences. They hold centuries of memory, conflict, negotiation, and transformation. And by sharing what they mean to you, you're helping us build a living archive of perspectives. This isn't just a channel, it's a space for global dialogue, one story at a time. So if something in this video moved you, challenged you, or made you think more deeply, take a moment now. Like, subscribe, share, and most of all, lend your voice to this evolving conversation. Because history is not behind us, and the future of borders begins with how we choose to talk about them today.